Imagine a city, an underwater utopia, free from the constraints of society above, where innovation and progress reign supreme. But what happens when its visionary founder grapples with the very ideals he set forth? Dive into the depths of Rapture with us and witness the rise and fall of Andrew Ryan. Born as a citizen of the Russian Empire, Andrew Ryan's humble beginnings can be traced back to a small village in Minsk in what we now know as Belarus. Having survived the atrocities of World War I, Ryan watched as the Russian Revolution of 1917 allowed the Bolsheviks to assume power, leaving his family's business in tatters. To add insult to injury, Andrew could only look on in horror as his aunt and uncle were brutally executed by members of the Red Guard as part of a purge that was intended to wipe out all opposition to the Bolsheviks' communist regime. Shortly after this, Andrew managed to escape with his father to Constantinople. As a direct consequence of what he had witnessed under the rule of the Bolsheviks, the young Andrew Ryan came to the conclusion that everything good about the modern world was the result of the efforts of great individuals who had worked tirelessly to forge their own path in life. Moreover, whenever parasites managed to seize control of such a world, they would simply bring it to rack and ruin. Ryan then made his way to the US in 1919 as he believed it was a country in which a great man would be able to achieve greatness. As it turned out, Ryan was indeed correct, as he soon became extraordinarily wealthy after striking oil on his property and making a series of good investments soon thereafter. As the owner of Ryan Oil, Andrew quickly became one of the richest men in the US. But then during the Great Depression, which spanned the 1930s, and thanks to a series of state-run social programs that were created to uplift embattled Americans, Ryan developed a special distaste for socialist and collectivist ideals. In his view, a man could only own what he had earned through hard work and dedication. After the government tried to nationalize a forest Ryan had purchased for himself as his own personal retreat, he burnt it to the ground so as to deny any parasites the opportunity of acquiring it for themselves. Ultimately though, after a lifetime of trauma and disappointment, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 was the final straw for Ryan. To his mind, the A-bomb was the greatest imaginable affront to what he stood for. It was the perfect marriage of scientific ingenuity and human determination harnessed for the sole purpose of causing death and destruction, thus providing the parasites with the ability to simply annihilate anything they could not claim for themselves. In order to escape the limitations imposed on him by governments, organizations, and religious groups, which are all merely examples of the parasites Ryan constantly referred to, and because he foresaw the end of humanity as a result of a nuclear apocalypse, Ryan set to work contacting like-minded individuals to help him realize his vision of building an underwater city on the seafloor of the North Atlantic. Ryan dubbed his project Rapture, which means an intense feeling of joy or pleasure, or when considered in the biblical sense, the event in which believers are immediately transported to heaven during the second coming of Christ. After choosing a site located somewhere between Iceland and Greenland, construction began in earnest in 1945. Materials and resources were acquired in secret so as not to attract any unwanted attention, and numerous ships were used to transport said materials thousands of miles across the ocean to the construction site. Using highly innovative methods and the latest technology available, Rapture was built piece by piece and eventually completed 6 years later in 1951. Following this monumental achievement, Ryan set about filling Rapture with thousands of the world's most talented, intelligent individuals, as he believed this would be necessary in attaining his dream of an ideal meritocratic society. As Ryan himself put it, Rapture was
a city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the great would not be constrained by the small, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality.
In other words, Rapture was a gulch, which is a name that comes from Galt's Gulch, a fictional location that features in libertarian author Ayn Rand's 1957 novel Atlas Shrugged. Put more simply, Rapture's society revolved around the idea that every individual is free to pursue their own self-interests without having to concern themselves with the needs of others. As such, notions of innovation, ambitiousness, free thought, logic, and scientific reason were all upheld as values that were absolutely necessary if the citizens of Rapture were to achieve their lofty goals. In the beginning, Rapture flourished thanks to its population of highly gifted individuals and unrestricted capitalist ideals, not to mention a significant amount of money that was invested into new ventures and scientific endeavors. This initial prosperity led many to believe that Ryan would actually succeed in realizing his objectivist ideals and that a utopia would indeed be possible, especially when compared with the surface world. But as the years went by, Rapture's individualistic free market policies, along with a complete and utter lack of social programs and labor laws, opened up a growing divide between the underwater city society's haves and have-nots. Since Ryan saw charity or any kind of welfare as parasitic in nature, the poor of Rapture were left to wallow in their misery, unable to improve their circumstances or simply find enough food to sustain themselves. For this reason, the working class in Rapture began to resent the world Ryan had created, seeing it as inhumane and heartless. Meanwhile, cracks in Ryan's already troubled psyche were beginning to show more prominently, and as his paranoia and hostility towards those he labeled parasites intensified, he formally declared that all contact with the surface world would be terminated. The justification for this was that Ryan was simply trying to keep Rapture's existence a secret and ensure its continued survival since the world above was now embroiled in a Cold War. But then, just as things seemed at their lowest, the discovery of a substance known as Adam at some point between 1948 and 1952 by one Dr. Bridget Tenenbaum changed everything. If Adam was refined into something called a plasmid and used in conjunction with another actuating chemical known as Eve, a subject would be able to manipulate their genetic code without any limitations other than what their mind could conjure. Needless to say, Adam soon became an integral component of life in Rapture, and productivity went into overdrive, bringing about an age of unprecedented creativity and prosperity. But there was a major problem with Adam. While it imbued those who used it with immense potential, it was also highly addictive, so the more someone used it, the more they craved and depended on it. This inevitably meant that users would require higher dosages of Adam over time to satisfy their cravings, and if a user was unable to gain access to the wonder drug, they would be driven to madness and their bodies to decay. And thus, as more and more people used Adam across Rapture, demand for the drug became a perpetual need that increasingly needed satisfying. This allowed a man by the name of Frank Fontaine to establish an illegal operation and build a criminal empire from smuggling in goods from the surface, thus providing him with the necessary funds to finance a lucrative Adam industry. The mass production of Adam led to a much wider availability, which meant that people became fully dependent on the drug for their survival and continued well-being. This allowed Fontaine to exert greater influence over the inhabitants of Rapture, so he began plotting to remove Ryan from power and take it for himself. Ryan soon went from admiring Fontaine's ambition and industriousness to suspecting him of numerous crimes such as Rapture's issue with smuggling. Realizing that Fontaine now rivaled his power, Ryan ordered his arrest in 1958. However, Fontaine resisted and was seemingly killed in the shootout between his group and Ryan's. The leader of Rapture then seized control of Fontaine's assets with the help of the Rapture Central Council. This move would ultimately prove to be a disastrous one, as the population's growing demand for Adam soon brought about civil unrest across the city. A man by the name of Atlas then rallied together the disenfranchised masses and started a guerrilla war with the intent of overthrowing Ryan and establishing a new order with the people of Rapture's interests in mind. Ryan was forced to take drastic steps to maintain his hold over Rapture, so he began by dismantling the Rapture Central Council and installing himself as the city's authoritarian ruler. He then introduced numerous highly restrictive laws along with increasingly severe punishments to discourage problem citizens. Despite his idealism and hope, Ryan had become the very thing he had escaped when he was just a young man. Then on New Year's Eve 1958, Atlas organized a huge working-class uprising where revolutionaries targeted a number of upper-class locations. Soon, Rapture was engaged in a bloody civil war, its ferocity only made worse by the populace's debilitating Adam addiction. A genetic arms race soon followed, with the members of each side using greater quantities of plasmids to gain the advantage over their opposition. As Bill McDonough put it,
"It's not about who can build the best guns and the biggest bombs, it's about who can become less of a man and more of a monster."
Over the course of about 4 months, Rapture's society crumbled and its infrastructure was severely compromised. Chaos reigned across the city, and any semblance of order that had once existed was long gone. As a result of the devastating civil war and unfettered Adam addiction, the once prosperous underwater metropolis had virtually disintegrated. A large number of citizens became Adam-addicted splicers, while the remainder were either killed, committed suicide, or simply starved to death. In just over a decade, the dream of Rapture had turned into a waking nightmare, and anything that had once made the city and its population great was long forgotten. Then in 1960, after a year of war and violence, Rapture was on the verge of total collapse. So in a desperate effort to gain control over the crumbling city, Fontaine, who was posing as Atlas, summoned Jack to hunt down and kill Ryan. Although Rapture was heavily damaged, Ryan was still taking active steps to keep everything together, using automated repair systems and big daddies to stop everything from falling apart completely. Believing Jack to be an undercover agent, Ryan dispatched wave after wave of splicers to deal with him, which ultimately proved futile. Growing impatient, Ryan destroyed the trees in Arcadia, thus cutting off Rapture's oxygen supply. However, with the aid of Julie Langford, Jack managed to restore Arcadia's greenery. He then made his way to Hephaestus in Ryan's office. All the while, Ryan had been figuring out Jack's true identity. As Jack drew near, Ryan initiated a self-destruct sequence to annihilate Rapture in order to prevent Fontaine from assuming control. Jack then managed to overcome and kill Ryan, and after stopping the self-destruct sequence, he faced off against Atlas, who later revealed himself to be Fontaine, in his hideout. After killing Fontaine, Jack escaped Rapture, living out the rest of his life with his rescued little sisters in peace. And so for the most part, this is the tragic story of Andrew Ryan in Rapture. Although he had started off with great promise and admirable motives, Ryan was blind to the realities of human nature, much like all idealists. Unfortunately, there are no simple solutions in life, and all philosophies and ideologies, however good they may be in theory, are flawed in practice as individual and collective human interests inevitably end up clashing. And the sad irony for Ryan is that he became the very thing he despised the most and was, in the end, no better than the Bolsheviks or US government he saw as parasites. Intellect, hope, idealism, and good intent are simply not enough. The darker aspects of the human psyche cannot be overcome, and ultimately, even the greatest and most powerful of empires are brought to ruin. And in the case of Rapture, it only took about 13 years for this to transpire. The biggest problem with Ryan is that he was selfish and self-interested, and because of his callousness and greed, he was undone by those that were simply reflections of himself. Calling Ryan evil may be a bit of a stretch, but misguided, naive, and desperate, he certainly was. Ryan's life and the events of BioShock are thus a cautionary tale that tells us to tread lightly and use our good judgment to make sensible, informed decisions whenever possible. And thus ends this video on the rise and fall of Andrew Ryan. What do you think of Ryan's story? Was he simply misguided, or was he actually a villain all along? Let us know in the comments. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for daily gaming, VR, and tech content. From me and the crew, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Later!